She thought she was just doing what anyone else would do. She thought she was saving a helpless child, shivering in the rain. But when Sophie Miller knelt down on that dirty Chicago pavement to wipe the blood from a stranger's face, she wasn't just offering a helping hand. She was signing a contract in invisible ink. She had no idea that the shivering boy was the only heir to the Moretti crime syndicate, and the man coming to look for him wasn't the police. He was the devil himself. Sophie was about to learn that in this city no good deed goes unpunished, and some debts are paid in blood and obsession. The neon sign of Sal's 24-hour diner flickered with a dying buzz, casting a sickly yellow light onto the wet pavement of Fifth Avenue. It was 3:15 a.m. Sophie Miller untied her grease-stained apron, her fingers stiff from 8 hours of carrying heavy trays and scrubbing tables. She winced as she stretched her back. At 23, she felt like she was 50. The smell of stale coffee and burnt bacon clung to her hair, a scent she couldn't wash out, no matter how hard she scrubbed. "Don't forget to lock the back, Sophie," Sal shouted from his office, his voice gruff. He was a decent boss, but he didn't pay for overtime, and he certainly didn't pay for cabs. "I got it, Sal. Good night," Sophie called back, pushing open the heavy metal door into the alleyway. The Chicago wind hit her like a physical slap. It was late October, and the air had teeth. Sophie pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her frame. It was 3 sizes too big a thrift store find that swallowed her whole, but it was the only thing standing between her and the biting cold. She began her walk home. It was a 20-minute trek to her studio apartment in the crumbling tenements of the Lower West Side. It wasn't safe, especially not at this hour, but when your bank account balance sat at $14.50, safety was a luxury you couldn't afford. She kept her head down, walking quickly past the boarded-up storefronts and overflowing dumpsters. Her mind was a loop of anxieties. Rent is due in 3 days. Mom needs her insulin refill on Friday. The electric bill is past due. She turned the corner onto Wacker Drive, intending to cut through a narrow service lane to save time. That's when she heard it. A whimper. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind and the distant rumble of the L train. Sophie froze her hand, instinctively clutching the pepper spray on her keychain. She scanned the darkness. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. Nothing. She took a step forward, squinting into the shadows behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets. There, curled into a tight ball against the brick wall, was a shape. It looked like a pile of discarded laundry until it moved. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. Logic screamed at her to run. This was how horror movies started. This was how girls on the news ended up missing. But then the shape coughed a wet, rattling sound that broke her heart. She stepped closer. "Hey, are you okay?" The figure lifted its head. The light from a distant street lamp sliced through the alley, illuminating a face that made Sophie gasp. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. He was wearing a suit, a tuxedo actually, but it was torn and muddy. And there was blood. So much blood. It matted his dark curls and stained the white collar of his shirt crimson. All her fear evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Sophie dropped to her knees on the wet asphalt, ignoring the cold water soaking into her jeans. "Oh my God," she breathed, reaching out but afraid to touch him. "Honey, can you hear me? Where are your parents?" The boy's eyes were wide, glassy with shock and pain. He was shivering so violently, his teeth chattered. He tried to speak, but only a wheeze came out. He pointed weakly to his chest. Sophie looked down. He was clutching his ribs. "You're hurt," she said, her voice shaking. She looked around frantically. The street was deserted. She fumbled for her phone, intending to call 911, but the boy's hand shot out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength. He shook his head frantically. His eyes were terrified. No police. "You need a doctor," Sophie insisted. "You're bleeding from your head." The boy squeezed her wrist harder, tears mixing with the grime on his face. He mouthed the word, "Please." Sophie hesitated. She knew the look in those eyes. She had seen it in the mirror enough times. It was the look of someone who knew that the system wasn't there to save them. "Okay," she whispered, making a decision she knew was reckless. "Okay. No cops. But we can't stay here. You'll freeze to death." She took off her oversized coat and wrapped it around his small, trembling shoulders. "My name is Sophie. I live 3 blocks away. I have a first aid kit. Can you walk?" The boy nodded weakly. Sophie helped him stand, wrapping an arm around his waist to support him. He was heavy, dead weight against her side. They moved slowly through the shadows, Sophie constantly checking over her shoulder. The city felt different tonight. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. Every car that passed made her heart jump. She didn't notice the black SUV idling 2 blocks down, its headlights off. She didn't see the man in the passenger seat watching them through thermal binoculars, speaking quietly into a radio. "Target located. A civilian has him. Moving south." Sophie dragged the boy up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, her muscles burning. She unlocked the door and kicked it open, guiding him to her lumpy sofa. The apartment was tiny, just a room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it was warm. She grabbed her first aid kit from under the sink. It was meager rubbing alcohol gauze butterfly strips and some ibuprofen. "This is going to sting," she warned him gently. She cleaned the gash on his forehead. It was deep, probably needing stitches, but the bleeding had slowed. The blood on his shirt wasn't from a wound there. It had dripped down. But his ribs? She lifted his shirt. A massive bruise, purple and black, blossomed across his side. He had been kicked or hit with something heavy. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, applying a cold pack. The boy didn't answer. He just watched her with intense, intelligent, dark eyes. He looked like a fallen prince out of place among her peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture. "Are you hungry?" she asked, trying to normalize the situation. I have grilled cheese ingredients." He nodded. Sophie went to the kitchenette. As the butter sizzled in the pan, she looked back at him. He had pulled her coat tighter around himself and was staring at the door, his body tense, waiting. She didn't know it then, but Sophie Miller had just intervened in a war. The boy sitting on her couch was Leo Moretti, the son of Dominic Moretti, the capo of the Chicago outfit. And by bringing him into her home, she hadn't just saved a life. She had painted a target on her own back. The sun hadn't even risen when the world fell apart. Sophie had fallen asleep in the armchair, keeping a vigil over the boy Leo. He had finally drifted off around 4:30 a.m., clutching a pillow like a lifeline. It was 6 a.m. when the sound of shattering wood jerked her awake. There was no knock, no warning. Her front door didn't just open. It exploded inward, splintering off its hinges with a deafening crash. Sophie screamed, scrambling backward, tripping over her own feet. 3 men stormed into the tiny apartment. They moved with military precision, dressed in tactical black gear guns, drawn and raised. They filled the small space, instantly sucking the air out of the room. Clear left, clear right. Target acquired. Sophie put her hands up, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might vomit. Don't shoot. Please don't shoot. He's just a kid. The men ignored her. Two of them flanked the sofa where Leo was waking up groggy and terrified. They didn't touch him, they just formed a human shield around him, weapons pointed at the windows and the door. Then the silence fell. It was heavier than the noise. A fourth man walked in through the broken doorway. If the first three men were soldiers, this man was the general. He was tall, well over 6 feet, wearing a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Sophie would earn in 10 years. He didn't have a gun drawn. He didn't need one. He radiated a terrifying, controlled violence. His hair was dark, swept back, and his eyes were the color of cold steel. He stepped over the debris of her door, his polished shoes crunching on the wood splinters. He surveyed the room with a look of utter disdain. The peeling paint, the cheap rug, and finally, Sophie huddled in the corner in her pajamas. He looked at the boy. Leonardo. His voice was deep calm and terrifyingly authoritative. The boy, Leo, sat up. Papa! The man Dominic Moretti didn't rush to hug his son. He walked over slowly, inspecting the bandage on the boy's head and the bruise on his ribs. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. That was the only sign of emotion he showed. He turned to Sophie. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He walked toward her. Sophie pressed her back against the wall, nowhere left to go. She was trembling uncontrollably. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it resonated in her chest. Sophie, she stammered. Sophie Miller. And Sophie Miller, Dominic said, stepping into her personal space, towering over her. Why do you have my son? I found him, she managed to say. In the alley. He was hurt. He was bleeding. Dominic's eyes narrowed. He signaled to one of his men. Check the room. Find the ransom note. Find the wire. There's no note, Sophie cried out, finding a spark of courage through her fear. I didn't kidnap him, I helped him. He was freezing to death on Wacker Drive. Dominic stared at her, analyzing her every micro-expression. He reached out his hand, gloved in black leather, and tilted her chin up. Sophie held her breath. He was terrifyingly handsome, in the way a storm or a predator is beautiful. You expect me to believe, Dominic said softly, that a waitress living in... He glanced around the room. This squalor found the most valuable leverage in Chicago and just decided to give him a grilled cheese sandwich. He gestured to the empty plate on the table. I didn't know who he was, Sophie whispered, tears prickling her eyes. I just saw a hurt kid. I swear. Papa. Leo's voice cut through the tension. Dominic turned his head, not releasing Sophie's chin. Quiet, Leo. Papa let her go. Leo said, his voice stronger now. He stood up, wincing as his ribs flared with pain. She's telling the truth. The men, the ones who took me, they dumped me when the cops drove by. I ran. I hid. She found me. Leo walked over and stood between his father and Sophie. He placed a small hand on Dominic's arm. She carried me, Papa. She gave me her coat. Dominic looked down at his son, then back at the oversized, cheap coat draped over the sofa. He looked back at Sophie. He released her chin, stepping back slowly. He took off his leather gloves, one by one, revealing scarred knuckles. He studied Sophie again. This time, he wasn't looking at a threat. He was looking at an anomaly. "You have no idea who I am, do you, Miss Miller?" he asked. "No." Sophie lied. She had a guess now. She had seen the news. She knew the name Moretti. Everyone in Chicago knew the name Moretti. They were the reason you didn't look at certain cars too long. "Good," Dominic said. He reached into his suit jacket. Sophie flinched, expecting a gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick envelope. He tossed it onto her kitchen table. It landed with a heavy thud. $50,000, Dominic said coldly. "For your trouble, and for your slunts." Sophie stared at the envelope. It was more money than she had ever seen. It could pay off her mom's medical bills. It could move her out of this dump. "And the door," Dominic added, glancing at the wreckage. "My men will have it fixed within the hour." He turned to leave his hand resting on Leo's shoulder. The soldiers lowered their weapons, preparing to move out. Sophie looked at the money, then at the man. Something inside her snapped. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the sheer indignity of having her home invaded and being treated like a criminal for saving a life. "I don't want your money," she said. The room went silent again. The soldiers stopped. Dominic Moretti stopped. He turned around slowly. "Excuse me." Sophie grabbed the envelope and held it out to him, her hand shaking but her chin high. "I didn't help him for money. I helped him because he was a child who was bleeding. Take your money and get out of my apartment." Dominic stared at her. For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face. He looked at the money in her hand, then at her defiant blue eyes. He laughed a dark, dry sound that lacked any humor. "You're a fool, Sophie Miller," he said, "or you're incredibly brave." He didn't take the envelope. "Keep it," he commanded. "Consider it a down payment." "A down payment on what?" she asked, confused. Dominic walked back to her, leaning in close so his whisper brushed against her ear. She smelled expensive cologne gun oil and rain. "Because the people who tried to take my son are going to come looking for the loose ends," he whispered. "And you, Sophie, are a loose end. You saved a Moretti. That makes you my problem now." He pulled back, his eyes locking onto hers. "Pack a bag, Miss Miller. You're coming with us." "What?" "No." Sophie backed away. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Dominic buttoned his jacket. "It wasn't a request. The Rossi family knows you found him. If I leave you here, you'll be dead by sunset." He gestured to his men. "Escort her, gently." As two of the soldiers moved toward her, Sophie looked at Dominic in horror. She realized the money wasn't a reward. It was severance pay for her old life. "Welcome to the family," Dominic said, turning his back on her as he walked out into the hallway. Sophie watched him go, realized her life as a waitress was over. She was now a pawn in a game she didn't understand, held captive by a man whose eyes promised both protection and ruin. The walk from her apartment building to the waiting convoy of black SUVs felt like a funeral procession for Sophie's old life. Her neighbors, Mrs. Higgins with her curlers, and Old Man Miller, no relation who sat on the stoop all day, were peering out from behind cracked blinds and half-open doors. They didn't wave. They didn't ask if she was okay. In this neighborhood, when men in suits with earpieces showed up, you didn't ask questions. You just prayed you weren't next. The morning air was damp and gray, the Chicago sky looking like a bruised peach. "Get in," Dominic said. It wasn't a suggestion. He held the door of the lead vehicle open, an armored Maybach, that looked more like a tank disguised as a luxury sedan. Sophie hesitated on the curb. She had her backpack slung over one shoulder containing a change of clothes, her toothbrush, a photo of her mother, and her phone. That was it. That was the sum total of her existence. "If I get in that car," Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper, "I can't come back, can I?" Dominic looked at her. For a second, the mask of the ruthless capo slipped, revealing a tired man underneath. "If you stay here, Sophie the Rossi hit squad will be scrubbing your blood off the pavement by noon to get to me. Getting in is the only way you survive." She looked at the crumbling brick of her building, then at Leo, who was already in the back seat, his pale face pressed against the tinted glass, watching her. He looked terrified that she might leave him. Sophie exhaled a shaky breath and climbed in. The interior smelled of rich mahogany, crushed leather, and something sharp gunpowder and mint. The door thudded shut with a heavy pressurized seal that cut off the noise of the city instantly. The silence was deafening. Dominic slid in beside her. The space was massive, yet with him sitting there, it felt suffocatingly intimate. He radiated heat and a sense of leashed power. He tapped the partition glass. "Drive! Take the Lake Shore route. Watch for tails." As the car pulled away, merging smoothly into the chaotic morning traffic, Sophie pressed herself against the door, putting as much distance between her and Dominic as possible. Leo, sitting on the opposite rear-facing seat, reached out his small hand. Sophie took it instinctively. His grip was tight, his fingers cold. "Are you okay?" she asked him softly. Leo nodded, but his eyes were heavy. The adrenaline of the night was wearing off, replaced by the crash of trauma. Within minutes, his head lulled, and he slumped sideways, falling into a fitful sleep. That left Sophie alone with the monster. She refused to look at him, staring instead at the passing blur of the city. The skyscrapers of downtown Chicago rose up like steel giants, indifferent to her plight. "You're shaking." Dominic's voice broke the silence. It was low, a baritone rumble that she felt in the seat of the car. "I'm terrified," Sophie admitted, not turning her head. "I just got kidnapped by the Mafia." "Protective custody," he corrected calmly. "There is a difference. Not from where I'm sitting." She finally turned to face him. He was reading a file on a tablet, his legs crossed, looking as if he were commuting to a board meeting rather than fleeing a potential assassination attempt. "Who are you really? People don't just have armies." Dominic set the tablet down. He turned his steel-grey eyes on her, and Sophie felt like a butterfly pinned to a board. He analyzed her, dissecting her fear, her anger, and her curiosity. "I am a businessman, Sophie. I deal in logistics construction and conflict resolution," he said, the euphemism dripping with irony. "My family has run this city for 60 years. The Moretti name is the reason the garbage gets picked up and the docks stay open. But power creates vacuums, and vacuums attract rats." "The Rossi family," Sophie recalled the name he'd mentioned earlier. "Rats," Dominic confirmed, his jaw tightening. "They broke the truce. Touching a family member is forbidden. It's a death sentence. By taking Leo, they declared war. And you—" He paused, his gaze dropping to her hands, which were still clutching her backpack straps, white-knuckled. "You are the civilian who walked into the middle of a firing squad." "I just wanted to help," she whispered. "I know," Dominic said. His voice softened just a fraction. "And that is the most dangerous thing you could have done. Innocence is a liability in my world, Sophie. It gets people killed. He reached into a compartment and pulled out a bottle of water, handing it to her. The cap was already twisted loose. It was a small gesture, but a thoughtful one. Drink. You look like you're going to faint. Sophie took the water. Her throat was parched. Where are we going? The Citadel, Dominic said, turning back to his tablet. My home. It's the only place in Illinois where I can guarantee Leo sees his next birthday. The drive took 40 minutes. They moved from the claustrophobic city streets to the winding, tree-lined roads of the wealthy northern suburbs. The houses grew further apart, hidden behind high stone walls and iron gates. Finally, the car slowed. Sophie looked out the window and gasped. Home was an understatement. It was a fortress. Massive wrought iron gates, easily 20 feet tall, swung open automatically as the convoy approached. Security cameras swiveled to track them. Men with assault rifles patrolled the perimeter of the stone wall that seemed to stretch for miles. The driveway was a winding ribbon of asphalt leading up to a sprawling mansion that looked like it had been transported from the Italian countryside. It was beautiful, breathtakingly so, with ivy climbing the stone facade and fountains playing in the courtyard. But Sophie noticed the details. The windows were too thick bulletproof glass. The gardeners were too alert security in disguise. The car stopped in front of the massive double doors. Welcome to hell, Dominic murmured, though whether he meant it for her or himself. Sophie couldn't tell. He got out, buttons his suit jacket, and instantly the mask was back in place. He was the Don again. He walked around to open the door for Leo, picking the sleeping boy up in his arms with surprising tenderness. Sophie stepped out onto the gravel driveway. The air here was cleaner, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was quiet. Too quiet. Follow me, Dominic commanded, not looking back. And don't wander off. The dogs aren't trained to be friendly to strangers. Sophie swallowed hard and followed him up the grand steps, walking into the lion's den. The interior of the Moretti estate was a study in cold perfection. Sophie stood in the grand foyer, feeling painfully small. The floors were black marble, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the crystal chandelier hanging 2 stories above. A double staircase swept upward, framing a massive oil painting of a stormy sea. It was silent. Not the peaceful silence of a library, but the heavy, oppressive silence of a mausoleum. There were no family photos, no coats thrown over a banister, no toys. It was a house that had been scrubbed clean of life. Dominic was already halfway up the stairs carrying Leo. He paused and looked down at her. Mrs. Gable, he barked. A door under the stairs opened, and a severe-looking woman in a grey uniform stepped out. She had hair pulled back so tight it pulled at her eyes, and an expression that suggested smiling caused her physical pain. Yes, sir. Take Miss Miller to the East Wing guest suite. The blue room, Dominic ordered. Get her fresh clothes. Burn what she's wearing. Burn, Sophie protested, looking down at her jeans. These are my only jeans. They are covered in alley filth and my son's blood, Dominic said dismissively. You will be provided with suitable attire. Dinner is at 7. Do not be late. He turned and disappeared into the shadows of the upper hallway with Leo. Sophie was left standing with Mrs. Gable, who looked her up and down with undisguised disapproval. Follow me, Mrs. Gable said crisply. Sophie was led up the stairs down a long corridor lined with antique vases that probably cost more than her entire education, and into a room at the far end of the hall. Mrs. Gable opened the door, and Sophie stepped inside. If the rest of the house was cold, This room was overwhelming. It was massive, dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in blue velvet. French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking the grounds. There was a fireplace, a sitting area, and an ensuite bathroom that was larger than her entire apartment. "I will bring you something to wear," Mrs. Gable said, and then with a definitive click she closed the door. Sophie heard the lock turn. She rushed to the door, twisting the handle. Locked. "Hey!" she shouted, pounding on the wood. "You can't lock me in here. Mr. Moretti's orders." Mrs. Gable's voice came muffled through the wood. "For your safety, miss. The house is in lockdown." Sophie slumped against the door, sliding down until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. She wasn't a guest. She was a prisoner. A prisoner in a golden cage. Hours passed. Sophie explored every inch of her prison. She showered in the marble bathroom, scrubbing the city grime off her skin until she was pink. She wrapped herself in a plush white robe that felt like a cloud. True to her word, Mrs. Gable returned, unlocking the door briefly to slide a garment bag inside before locking it again. Inside was a simple and elegant faded dress. It was silk conservative, but clearly expensive. It fit Sophie perfectly. Too perfectly. Dominic must have estimated her size just by looking at her. The thought made her shiver. At 6:55 p.m., the lock clicked open. Mrs. Gable stood there. "Mr. Moretti is waiting in the dining room." Sophie walked out. Her chin held high. She might be a prisoner, but she wouldn't act like a victim. They walked through the silent house to a dining room that could seat 30 people. At the far end of a long mahogany table sat Dominic. He had changed into a fresh black shirt. The sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing muscular forearms covered in faint scars. He was reading a file again. There was no sign of Leo. Sophie walked the length of the table and stood at the chair opposite him. "Sit," he said, not looking up. "Where is Leo?" Sophie asked, remaining standing. Dominic finally looked up. His eyes were tired, rimmed with red. "He is resting. The doctor gave him a sedative. The trauma. It is difficult." "He needs comfort, not drugs," Sophie said sharply. Dominic's eyes narrowed. "I didn't bring you here for parenting advice, Miss Miller." "Sit." Sophie sat. A server appeared from the shadows, placing a plate of roasted duck and truffled potatoes in front of her. It smelled divine, but Sophie's stomach was tied in knots. "Why am I locked in?" she asked, her voice steady. "Because until my security team sweeps the perimeter and identifies the leak that led to Leo's abduction, no one moves freely," Dominic said, cutting his meat with precise surgical strokes. "Not even me." "And then what?" Sophie pushed. "Do I stay here forever? I have a job. I have a life." Dominic stopped eating. He put his knife and fork down slowly. "You had a job at a diner that paid you minimum wage. You had a life where you struggled to pay for insulin," Dominic said. Sophie went cold. "How do you know about the insulin?" "I know everything, Sophie. I ran a background check on you the moment you walked into my house," Dominic said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Sophie Miller, father deceased. Mother Alice Miller, currently in assisted living at St. Jude's, suffering from type 2 diabetes and early onset dementia. You are 3 months behind on her care payments." Sophie stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "You stay away from my mother." "I already have," Dominic said calmly. "I paid the bill. She is covered for the next year. I also had her moved to a private room." Sophie stood there, stunned. Her anger collided with relief, creating a confusing storm in her chest. Why would you do that? Because I pay my debts, Dominic said, taking a sip of red wine. You saved my son, I saved your mother. We are even. If we're even, let me go, Sophie challenged. Dominic stood up then. He walked around the long table, moving with that predatory grace. He stopped inches from her. The air between them crackled with tension. I can't, he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. Because Leo is asking for you. Sophie blinked. What? He woke up 10 minutes ago, screaming. Dominic admitted a flicker of pain crossing his face. He wouldn't let me touch him. He wouldn't let the nurse near him. He kept asking for the lady with the coat, for Sophie. Dominic looked down at her, and for the first time, Sophie saw desperation in the eyes of the devil. I can buy armies, Sophie. I can buy politicians. I can buy silence, Dominic said, his voice tight. But I cannot buy my son's trust. He is broken. And for some God-forsaken reason, you are the only one who can glue him back together. He stepped back, offering her a hand. It was a business deal, but it felt like more. I am offering you a job, a real job. Be his companion, his nanny, whatever you want to call it. Live here. Be with him until he heals. And if I say no, Sophie asked, then you walk out that door, Dominic said. I'll give you a new identity to move you to another state for your safety. But Leo will be alone in this house with only ghosts and soldiers for company. He let the words hang in the air. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was weaponizing her compassion. Sophie looked at the grand, cold dining room. She thought of the little boy with the blood-matted hair and the terrified eyes. She thought of her mom safe in a private room. She looked at Dominic Moretti, a man who terrified her, yet who looked at her as if she were the only solution to an unsolvable equation. I have conditions, Sophie said softly. Dominic's lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. I expected nothing less. No more locking my door, she listed. I get to see my mum once a week. And you, she pointed a finger at his chest. You start acting like a father, not a CEO. Dominic stared at her finger on his chest. No one touched him. No one dared. He looked up into her eyes, the intensity scorching. Deal, he whispered. 2 weeks passed. The citadel, as Dominic called it, was a fortress of stone and silence. But slowly, imperceptibly, Sophie Miller was beginning to crack the foundation. It started with small things. The smell of lemons and disinfectant that usually permeated the hallways was replaced by the scent of warm cinnamon and baking bread. Sophie had convinced the terrifying French chef Pierre to let her use a corner of the kitchen to make pancakes for Leo. Then there was the sound. For years, the only sounds in the Moretti estate were hushed whispers and the click of hard-soled shoes on marble. Now there was the sound of running feet. You can't catch me. Leo's voice echoed through the grim portrait gallery. Sophie chased him, her laughter bright and foreign in the somber air. She caught him near a suit of medieval armor, scooping him up in a hug that made him squeal. For a moment, he wasn't the heir to a crime syndicate. He was just a 10-year-old boy. High above, standing on the mezzanine balcony, Dominic Moretti watched them. He stood in the shadows, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, though he hadn't taken a sip in 20 minutes. He was mesmerizingly still. He watched the way Sophie's hair, tied back in a messy bun, fell loose around her face as she spun his son around. He watched the way Leo clung to her, a look of pure safety on the boy's face that Dominic hadn't seen since his wife died 4 years ago. A strange, painful tightening gripped Dominic's chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was a hunger, a starvation he hadn't realized he was enduring until he saw the feast in front of him. "Sir." Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't turn around. He knew the footsteps of every man on his payroll. This was Bruno, his second in command, a bull of a man with no neck and a loyalty that had been bought with blood. "Report," Dominic said, his eyes still fixed on Sophie downstairs. "We found the safe house used by the kidnappers," Bruno said, his voice low. "It was empty. But we found something else. Phone records." Dominic finally turned. His face was a mask of cold fury. "And the call that tipped them off about Leo's route from school," Bruno hesitated. "It came from inside the organization boss. A burner phone, but the signal pinged off the tower nearest to this estate." Dominic's glass shattered in his hand. Shards of crystal fell to the floor, mixing with the whiskey and the blood dripping from his palm. He didn't even blink. "A traitor," Dominic whispered. "Here. We're scrubbing the personnel files," Bruno said, eyeing Dominic's bleeding hand nervously. "But until we find the rat, no one is safe. Especially not the girl." Dominic looked back down at the hall. Sophie was wiping something off Leo's cheek, smiling tenderly. "Keep a detail on her," Dominic ordered. "Shadows only. If she notices, you're fired. If she gets hurt, you're dead." Later that night, a thunderstorm rolled in off Lake Michigan, battering the stone walls of the house. Sophie was in the library, a massive room of 2-story bookshelves and a roaring fireplace. She was curled up in a leather armchair, reading Treasure Island aloud. Leo was asleep on the rug at her feet, his head resting on a giant pillow, a fortress of blankets around him. She stopped reading as she heard the heavy oak doors creak open. Dominic walked in. He looked exhausted. His tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck, and his shirt was unbuttoned at the top. He looked less like a king and more like a man carrying the weight of the world. He stopped when he saw them. The firelight danced across his sharp features, softening the harsh angles of his face. "He's asleep," Sophie whispered, closing the book. "He never sleeps during storms," Dominic said quietly, walking over to the liquor cabinet. "He used to be terrified of the thunder." "He feels safe now," Sophie said. Dominic poured himself a drink, his movements stiff. Sophie noticed the bandage wrapped around his right hand. "You're hurt," she said, standing up. Dominic looked at his hand. "Occupational hazard." Sophie walked over to him. In the 2 weeks she had been here, she had learned that Dominic Moretti was a man of few words, but his silence spoke volumes. She reached out her fingers, hovering over his bandaged hand. "Let me change the dressing. The blood is seeping through." Dominic stiffened. "It's fine, Sophie." "Sit down, Dominic," she said, her voice firm but gentle. It was the first time she had used his first name without the Mr. attached. To his own surprise, Dominic obeyed. He sat on the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. Sophie found the first aid kit she kept one nearby, now a habit from her life on the streets, and began to unwind the gauze. The cut was deep, slicing across his palm. But it was the other scars that caught her attention. His hands were a map of violence. Knife-point scars, burn marks, the calluses of a man who fought for a living. She cleaned the wound with delicate precision. Dominic watched her face. She was biting her lower lip in concentration. She smelled of vanilla and rain. She was so close he could see the gold flecks in her blue eyes. "Why do you stay?" he asked suddenly. His voice was rough, low. Sophie paused, holding his hand in hers. "We made a deal." "You could have run," Dominic said. "The night I brought you here, or any day since. The gate codes change, but you're smart. You could figure them out." "Leo needs me," she said simply. "And that's it?" Dominic challenged, leaning in closer. The air between them grew thick, charged with a magnetic tension that made Sophie's breath hitch. "Just Leo." Sophie looked up at him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the darkness in him, the danger that rolled off him in waves. But she also saw the man who had paid for her mother's care without being asked. She saw the father who stood on a balcony watching his son play, because he was too afraid his own touch would taint him. "I don't run from people who need help," Sophie whispered, "even if they're scary." Dominic's eyes dropped to her lips. For a second, just a heartbeat, Sophie thought he was going to kiss her. She found herself leaning in, drawn to the fire. He raised his uninjured hand, his thumb grazing her cheekbone. His skin was rough warm. "You should run, Sophie," he murmured, his voice laced with regret. "Because if you stay, I will ruin you. Darkness doesn't tolerate the light. It consumes it." "Maybe the light brightens the darkness," she countered breathlessly. Dominic's hand lingered on her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The distance between them was nothing. Crack! A massive clap of thunder shook the house. Leo stirred on the rug, whimpering. The spell broke. Dominic pulled his hand away, as if he had been burned. He stood up abruptly, putting distance between them, the mask slamming back into place. "Finish wrapping the hand, Miss Miller," he said coldly. "Then go to bed. We have guests tomorrow night." Sophie stood there, her skin still burning where he had touched her, confused and aching. She finished the bandage in silence, but as she left the library, she knew one thing for certain. The danger wasn't just the men with guns outside. The real danger was the man inside the house and the way he made her want to step into the fire. The following evening, the Citadel was transformed. It was the monthly sit-down, a tradition where the lieutenants of the Moretti crime family gathered to discuss territories, profits, and problems. In the past, these were held in smoke-filled backrooms. Under Dominic's reign, they were formal dinners conducted with the elegance of a corporate board meeting, but with infinitely higher stakes. Sophie was told to dress formally. "You are the governess," Mrs. Gable had instructed. "You will sit at the lower end of the table. You speak only when spoken to. Your job is to ensure Master Leo behaves." Sophie wore the black silk dress Dominic had provided. It was modest with long sleeves and a high neck, but it clung to her curves in a way that made her feel exposed. The dining room was dimly lit by candlelight. 12 men sat around the table. They looked like bankers, lawyers, and politicians. But Sophie noticed the bulges under their tailored jackets. She noticed the way they never sat with their backs to the door. Leo sat next to her, looking small and pale in his miniature tuxedo. He gripped Sophie's hand under the table. "Gentlemen," Dominic said from the head of the table. He didn't raise his voice yet. The room fell instantly silent. "Business." Sophie tried to make herself invisible as the men discussed shipments, dock unions, and overhead costs. It was terrifyingly mundane. They were talking about crime as if it were accounting. "The Rossi problem is escalating," said a man named Bruno, the one Sophie had seen before. They hit one of our trucks in the south side yesterday. Driver is in the ICU. They are provoking a reaction, Dominic said, smoothly swirling his wine. They want us to strike back sloppy. We will not give them the satisfaction. We strike with precision. Or maybe, a voice cut in from the middle of the table. We are looking weak, Dominic. The room went dead silent. Sophie looked up. The speaker was an older man with silver hair and a face like a road map of bad decisions. His name was Salzo. He was Dominic's uncle. Weak? Dominic asked softly. You sit here in your castle playing father. Salzo spat, glancing at Leo and then disdainfully at Sophie. You have a nanny at the war table. Your father, God rest his soul, would have buried the Rossi brothers by now. Instead, you negotiate. Sophie felt Leo tremble. She squeezed his hand. Dominic placed his glass down. He smiled. It was the most terrifying thing Sophie had ever seen. Uncle, Dominic said, you mistake patience for weakness. A tiger does not roar before it pounces. It waits. We are bleeding money. Salzo slammed his fist on the table. And we have a leak. Someone is feeding them intel. Maybe we should look at the newcomers. Salzo pointed a thick ringed finger directly at Sophie. Her, the waitress. Since she arrived, everything has gone to hell. How do we know she isn't planting bugs for the cops or sleeping with a Rossi? That's enough, Dominic said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the finality of a guillotine. Is it? Salzo stood up. I say we question her, properly, in the basement. Sophie's blood ran cold. The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably, but no one stood up to defend her. Dominic stood slowly. He adjusted his cufflinks. Salzo, Dominic said, walking down the length of the table. Sophie saved my son's life. She is under my protection. She's a liability, Salzo shouted, his face turning red. You're thinking with your... Dominic moved faster than Sophie's eyes could track. One moment he was walking. The next he had Salzo pinned against the oak-panelled wall, his forearm crushing the older man's windpipe. The room erupted. Chairs scraped back. Guns were drawn, 12 Glocks pointed in every direction. Leo screamed. Sophie instinctively threw her body over the boy, shielding him with her own back, squeezing her eyes shut. Nobody moves! Bruno roared, his own weapon, trained on Salzo's bodyguards. You question my judgment in my own house, Dominic hissed into Salzo's ear. You threaten my guest. Dominic, please. Salzo choked, his face turning purple. Dominic released him. Salzo slumped to the floor, gasping for air. Dominic straightened his jacket. He looked around the room at the drawn weapons. Put them away. We are not savages. Slowly, reluctantly, the guns were lowered. Dominic turned to Sophie. His eyes were what, fueled by adrenaline. Take Leo upstairs, now! Sophie grabbed Leo, pulling the sobbing boy towards the door. She was shaking so hard she could barely walk. She looked back one last time. Dominic was standing over his uncle, looking like a god of war. But as his eyes met hers, she saw a flicker of apology. I'm sorry you had to see this. Sophie rushed into the hallway, her heart pounding in her throat. She needed to get Leo to safety. She needed to get out of this insane asylum. She reached the bottom of the grand staircase when the lights went out. Not just the dining room, the entire estate. The chandeliers, the security lights, everything plunged into absolute pitch darkness. Papa! Leo cried out. Shh, Sophie whispered, clutching him tight. "It's okay. It's just a fuse." But she knew it wasn't a fuse. Then the red emergency lights flickered on, bathing the hallway in a blood-red glow. An alarm began to blare, a low, rhythmic pulse that vibrated in her teeth. Whoop, whoop, breach in Sector 4, breach in Sector 4, Sector 4, the kitchen entrance, the servants' quarters. Sophie froze. That was right behind them. From the darkness of the corridor leading to the kitchen she heard it. The soft thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire. The sound of bodies hitting the floor. Dominic's voice roared from the dining room behind her. "Ambush, secure the boy!" But the dining room doors were jammed shut. Someone had barred them from the outside. Sophie was alone in the hallway with Leo, and coming toward them, stepping out of the shadows, with night vision goggles and tactical gear, were 4 men who were definitely not Moretti's soldiers. They spotted her. "Target acquired," one of them said, his voice distorted by a mask. "Grab the kid. Kill the girl." Sophie didn't think. She didn't breathe. She grabbed a heavy marble bust from a pedestal and threw it with all her might at the first man, then grabbed Leo's hand. "Run!" Sophie didn't run like a victim. She ran like a mother protecting her young. She dragged Leo into the master suite, slamming the heavy oak double doors and throwing the deadbolt just as a heavy boot slammed against the wood from the other side. "Hide!" Sophie commanded, shoving Leo into the walk-in closet. "Under the clothes. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." "Sophie, no," Leo sobbed, grabbing her dress. "Go." She pushed him in and shut the closet door. She scanned the room for a weapon. A lamp. Too light. She grabbed a heavy bronze statue from the bedside table. She stood facing the bedroom door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart a drum of war. Crash! The bedroom doors splintered open. A mercenary masked and hulking stepped over the wreckage. He raised his gun, spotting Sophie instantly. He laughed a cruel, muffled sound. "Game over, sweetheart. Where's the boy? Gone." Sophie lied, gripping the bronze statue until her knuckles turned white. "You'll have to go through me." "That can be arranged." He cocked the weapon, aiming for her chest. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bullet. She didn't pray for herself. She prayed the closet door was thick enough to hide Leo's screams. Bang! The sound was deafening. Sophie flinched, waiting for the pain. But it never came. Instead, she heard a wet thud. She opened her eyes. The mercenary was on the floor, a hole in the center of his forehead. Standing in the doorway, framed by the smoke and the red emergency lights, was Dominic. He was covered in dust, his shirt torn, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. He looked terrifying. He looked magnificent. He stepped over the body, holstering his smoking gun. He didn't check the room. He didn't check the closet. He walked straight to Sophie. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice raw. "No," she whispered, the statue slipping from her numb fingers. "Leo, he's in the closet." Dominic let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He reached out and pulled Sophie into his arms, crushing her against his chest. It wasn't a gentle hug. It was desperate, possessive, the embrace of a man reclaiming his soul. "I thought I lost you." He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her fear and her bravery. "I saw you on the cameras. You fought for him. You were willing to die for him." "He's just a boy," she cried into his torn shirt. "No." Dominic pulled back, framing her face with his blood-stained hands. "He is my son. And you? You are not just a waitress, Sophie. You are the only person in this God-forsaken world worthy of standing beside me." Leo burst from the closet, running into their legs. Dominic scooped him up with one arm, keeping the other firmly around Sophie's waist. "The traitor?" Sophie asked, wiping her tears. "Salzo," Dominic said, his eyes hardening to cold steel. "He opened the gates. He thought if I died, he would take the throne. He was wrong. The guards have handled him." The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But for the first time since walking into the alleyway that rainy night, Sophie didn't feel afraid. She looked at Dominic, the monster who had destroyed the world for her, and realized she didn't want to leave. "So," Dominic whispered, resting his forehead against hers, "do you still want to run, Sophie Miller? Or are you ready to rule?" Sophie looked at the man who loved her and the boy who needed her. She smiled, a dangerous, beautiful thing. "I think," she whispered, "I'm done running." Sophie Miller's life as a poor waitress ended that night, but her life as the Queen of Chicago was just beginning. She had saved a fallen boy and tamed the devil himself, proving that sometimes the strongest heart isn't the one that wields the gun, but the one that stands in front of it. In a world of crime and shadows, she became their light and woe to anyone who tried to dim it. And that is the story of how a simple act of kindness in a dark alley changed the fate of an entire crime empire. It makes you wonder, if you found a fallen boy in the rain, would you have stopped, or would you have kept walking? If you enjoyed this story of danger, romance, and twists, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next episode. I want to know your thoughts. Do you think Sophie was crazy for staying, or was she brave? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.